today I'm trying to show you just how easy it is to increase your faith, maintain your faith, or even bring someone to the faith with false pretenses, these psychological tricks. Not to say that they are deliberate, that they are manipulative, though they can be, but this is even what one can do to themselves or what one hears and they're so moved by. And there's two terms I want you to really focus on: confirmation bias and apophenia. Apophenia, by the way, is just the general tendency to see connections or significance in data that is otherwise unrelated or unimportant. And it's so powerful because, again, we as humans are pattern-seeking machines. It's how we interpret the world. It's how we have grown and learned and developed. But there are those downsides when the system runs amok. And today I have a perfect example of that for you. Not only do I have the example, but this particular creator that we're going to look at wrote a pinned comment explaining the error of it and still getting it wrong. So we're going to talk about her apophenia, we're going to talk about her response, and then I'm going to give you, 5 examples where I can show you how easy it is to do this to the negative effect. Because what is always hilarious is, and this is where the confirmation bias comes in, when the Christian sees patterns in the Bible that they think are significant and it reinforces their faith, or it gives them the conviction that the Bible is true, or that God has always had a plan, or all of these things that they draw incorrectly from these supposed amazing connections, it's always to the positive benefit of what they already believe or are wanting to believe or are wanting better conviction of.
Hey, so quick Bible fact, let me know if you've heard this before. Both Moses and Jonah were called to a foreign land, and both of them tried to reject the call and be like, no, God, I'm not going. And then both of them faced almost near-death judgment for rejecting God's call. And then both of them were shown mercy, and God still didn't destroy them for trying to reject his clear call over their lives. And then God still was merciful enough to even use them in this foreign land for his good purposes. What God has planned and what God has deemed, he is going to make happen, even if we try and be disobedient. And praise the Lord for that he can work in, through, and despite us. Let me know if you've heard that before.
Her connection here between Moses and Jonah is silly. And it's incorrect. And it's going to show us what the Christian mind will do to hold on even to their incorrect connections. By the way, this is How to Faith a Life. I've done these other 2 videos on her, and it's never to pick on her. There are certain creators that I gravitate towards making 2 or 3 videos to show you the patterns within their thinking. And because they so represent such a large amount of how people think about this faith. But let's start with this claim itself. Moses and Jonah, is there a connection here? She lists a few points. The first one is that they were called to a foreign land. Well, not really. Moses was from Egypt. We can nitpick about that, but it's already a reach, just to create the initial connection. They didn't want to go. Sure, Jonah literally runs in the opposite direction, but Moses stays still. He just has a conversation with God expressing why he doesn't feel fit. But then he goes. Very different ways of having a disagreement with God. They faced near-death judgment and punishment from God. Well, that's true about Jonah, but that's not true about Moses. The verse she puts up on the screen is the story that I covered the other day of when God meets Moses and almost destroys him, kills him, because he didn't have his son circumcised. So his wife does it really quick and then touches it to Moses' feet, which is probably a euphemism, which probably makes the story even worse. And then God relents. So that part is blatantly wrong, and someone must have called her on it because she pinned a comment trying to excuse it. We're going to get to that. And then her last one is that they were shown mercy and still used by God. I'm sorry, what biblical figure is that not the story of? Shown mercy, used by God. By the way, the mercy is just that God doesn't destroy them when he wants to. It's not some beautiful story. So the connections are already incredibly weak. And again, it's because people want something new. I don't know exactly where she heard this. Maybe she read it in a Bible study that got published last year. Maybe it was what her small group leader thought they discovered last week. Maybe it was preached from the pulpit. Maybe she heard it on a podcast. I don't know. I just know that you have essentially unending content you can create from 800,000 words. And between confirmation bias, apophenia, and cherry picking, you're going to be able to create whatever you want. Literally, you can make this Bible say whatever you want. That's the examples I'm going to give you here at the end. But some stats on the Bible to help you understand how easy this is. We all know it's 66 books if we're talking about the Protestant canon. It's almost 1,200 chapters, 31,000 verses, and again, 800,000 words. Multiple authors across centuries, trying to build off each other purposely in many cases. Yeah, you're going to have some repeating themes. Even though this one, the example she gave is just really a bad example, she could have done better. In fact, I think it would be fun for you in the comments. I'm not actually going to do this. Maybe I'll do one or two. Pick any two names from the Bible, and I will make this little mini sermon out of it for you. How they're connected, what God is trying to show us through the understanding and study of both of these characters. It's too easy to do. There are literally hundreds of biblical figures within the texts. And even if there was only 100 that we really zoom in on, and even if we only talk about 5 major life events, just like she did, being called to go somewhere, not going there, almost getting destroyed for it, having mercy, still accomplishing God's will, right? If we just pull out 5 events from 100 characters, that's 10,000 possible overlaps before we even try to force the connections. With enough events, any random stories will start to look interconnected. It's like saying because 2 people had a bad day and they didn't want to go to work and their birthday happened to be that week, and within the last month they both almost got hit by a car, there's something happening. No, with a sample size large enough, you can find thousands of people that meet that criteria. This is part of critical thinking. This is part of understanding how to be rational and logical. And again, it's an education that people just don't get, and I'm not some expert on it. But I see so clearly how easy it is with just a little bit of knowledge about statistics or math or probability or psychology to understand how so much of what everyone thinks means things doesn't most of the time. So, at first my plan was just to show the errors in the reasoning here and then give some examples of how easy it is to reason in this erroneous way, but she pinned a comment. I'm going to read it to you. Here's another pattern in the Bible, what we call typology. I also want to add this in case anyone has questions about Moses' judgment in chapter 4, because at first it may seem like I did kind of misspeak on the Moses judgment, that it didn't pertain to his call to Egypt. Correct. But it depends on how you understand the judgment he faced and if it was integral to his call or not. Just wanted to note that. There are lots of really interesting exegesis on that whole section. Remember, on passages like that, if it feels weird or misplaced, we are probably misunderstanding it. Hashtag Bible facts. Hashtag Bible secrets. It's not a secret. It's a ridiculous connection that's not even correct that now you're trying to backpedal. And it's anything but a fact. So a few things are happening in this response. And again, I feel it's necessary to call out, not to diminish her, but to help prevent it in others. If you make a mistake, first of all, say you made a mistake. Moses' judgment obviously had nothing to do with the scenario she was trying to connect it to, that he didn't want to go to Egypt. That whole story where Moses is talking to God, I'm not fit, and God sending Aaron to help him and all of these things, that has absolutely no death threat in it. The thing with his son is simply because God likes his men cut. End of story. He commanded it, do it. If you don't, I'll kill you, even though I've got these supposed great plans for you. And when this direct argument failed for her, she retreated to the typology excuse, where she no longer has to prove the connections logically, which is what she was claiming to be able to do, because typology doesn't require evidence or logic, just vibes and intuition. It happens in Christianity all the time. Someone tries to make this great case, this very specific, this very detailed, this here is the evidence, look, it's indisputable, and then it fails for some reason, and they immediately retreat to something vague and abstract. God's mysteries, our lowly human status, typology, which for those of you that don't know, typology is just a way of interpreting the Bible specifically so that you can drag things out of the Old Testament that had absolutely no connection, but make it look like God had some preordained pattern in his mind existing all along that he wanted to show us, where we can see these earlier figures or events as types, as foreshadowing. Many people will say that Moses is a typology of Jesus, and that should show you exactly the problem. Typology is so obviously subjective. When you want to make the case that God is merciful and will work through broken people, you connect people like Moses and Jonah incorrectly. When that fails, you'll go back and you'll just claim that Moses is a type of Jesus because he frees people like Jesus frees people. I'm sorry, what is it we're supposed to learn from Moses? That Christ is good or that sin is bad? Like, if you can make everything out of anything, then nothing means anything. Typology is its own form of apophenia. It ignores original context, the patterns are forced. Again, the whole thing is a house of cards. There's so many other things we could point out here in her response. It depends on how you understand the judgment he faced. Yeah, so you're saying Christians can't agree. And if you agree on option 1, 2, or 3, you can make 3 different connections in how you'll utilize it for the purposes that you want. Thank you for proving that there's no real objective truth here, and it's all subjective feeling to make you feel convinced of something that you already want to be convinced of. But the biggest and most glaring problem, and hopefully you all caught it, it's beyond obvious here, is this. Remember, on passages like that, if it feels weird or misplaced, we are probably misunderstanding it! ! I hate that so much. Don't trust your brain. Don't trust your own logic or reasoning. When it comes to the Bible, turn it off completely. And if something looks bad or weird or incorrect or immoral or unjust, it's your fault. I'm going to be doing a video in the near future around the idea that when Christians say God is mysterious, what they really mean is God is ridiculous. It's not mysterious that God almost kills Moses for not having his son circumcised quickly enough, and that he is satiated by Zipporah cutting penis flesh off of her son and touching it to some body part on Moses. That's not mysterious, that's ridiculous. But I'll save the rest of my rant for that video. So here's what we're going to do for the rest of this video, because I think I've made my case on hers. I'm going to give you some more examples of how easy this is to do. What if I said, God likes to use men that are horrible fathers? That's a pattern that I see. Eli has sons who are corrupt priests, who steal sacrifices to the point that God has to kill them. Samuel's sons take bribes and pervert justice, as the Bible calls it. David's sons, you have one who rapes a sister, another who kills that one, another who rapes David's concubines, one who tries to overthrow his kingdom. Abraham's willing to kill his son. Jephthah actually does kill his daughter. Noah curses his son after being embarrassed to the point that 1/3 of his line is enslaved to the others. I mean, I could go on and on and on. What are we supposed to learn from this? The more you abuse your children, the more God will use you? I could just as easily make that statement as the statement she made about God using weak people to fulfill his purposes, and that's supposed to be inspirational and hopeful and beautiful. What about how God's prophets always seem to go insane? Surely that should tell us something. Ezekiel lays on his side for over a year and cooks his food on animal dung, only because he talked God down out of doing it from human feces. Isaiah walks naked for 3 years. Jeremiah is walking around with a yoke on his neck. Elijah is sending bears to kill children who make fun of his baldness. Saul and David both have a thing for stripping naked when they prophesize or praise the Lord. Micah also walks around naked and howling like a jackal. What does that say about God's character? What does it say about when you hear from the divine? God keeps choosing liars and tricksters on purpose. We talked about this a little bit with David the other day, but David's a deceiver. Jacob is a deceiver when he tricks his father for the birthright. Abraham lies about Sarah being his sister. And I could give about 100 more examples of that, a lot more than people running away from foreign lands that they're called to. We could talk about the patterns around all the barren women that God has. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Samson's mother, Hannah, and Elizabeth. What can we learn from God making these women barren just to sometimes use miracles to give them children? I could probably drum up a really beautiful sermon here and also a really negative, awful one. What about how the chosen one always has a real violent streak? Usually personally and also politically or militarily. For instance, Moses is a murderer even before he goes on to become a genocider for God. Same thing, David is a murderer individually and goes on to commit mass genocide. Even Paul starts as someone who's killing Christians. I guess violence is a prerequisite for being used by God. At least I could make that case based off these patterns. If her method proves the Bible, then my method should disprove it. But in reality, neither proves anything. It just shows that when you have a large text, you can find similarities. You can find whatever patterns you want to exist. Now, I gave you the examples I gave you because they're ones that you can just as easily take down and destroy like we did with hers. You can chalk it up to coincidence or happenstance, or you can make it sound beautiful like God is redeeming people. He wanted to use the worst of people so that everyday people like us could have hope. And again, that would be equally meaningless. But there are patterns in the Bible that should tell us things. And I want to point out this nuance. It might be unfair to say that God purposely likes to choose deceivers or violent men. But you know what's not incorrect to say is that through these examples and these multiple examples or patterns, we see that this is a God who is fine with violence, who does use it to get his will done, who approves of, condones, and commands deceit in order to fulfill his will. The pattern of God using massacre to deal with groups of people he disagrees with or feels aren't obeying him, whether it's the flood in Genesis or Sodom and Gomorrah or the Canaanite genocide or David's census punishment or any of the other examples or what's going to happen in the end days. Those are patterns, but those do tell us something about God. It tells us how he deals with his problems: destruction, wrath, anger, harm. So, I won't go on here, but I do think it's really important to be able to understand the difference between making connections that aren't there over similar stories and seeing real patterns that display character attributes about a God who claims the exact opposite. But that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something today. We'll have a new episode of Thinking Thursday coming up in a couple days, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Alexander, Ann, Boris, Eric, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kiboga, Matthew, Perry, and Sean; my Humanist Heroes, James, Jared, Christy, Matthew, and Thronus; my Atheist Advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.